Our community is very quick to write checks and take pictures, but what are we actually doing? When you're voting for down ballot races, which are very, very personal, congressional races, and then you're talking about state issues.
How can we, as South Asian Americans, make educated decisions about what to do? And how can we gather that information, vote in a way that's aligned with us?
In India, so many different types of Indian. They speak different languages, different castes, different foods. And I have to think at some level, in the US, the issues facing South Asians or Indians or Pakistanis are more similar. We're more alike here than we're different.
You were part of history regardless of what happened. And this is our community.
South Asians are making such a mark on the planet and in the world. And in fact, as we speak right now, we're in the US election cycle. It's kind of cool. I have to say the US election cycle.
The US election
we are global,
cycle.
Right? We are global. We've got listeners everywhere. In the US election cycle, we've got a candidate who has a South Asian ancestry, right?
Correct.
That is Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yes, we have heard all sorts of things. It was very exciting to watch her ascend to the vice presidential role. And now as she steps into this new role as becoming candidate for president, it's really interesting to see how the South Asians here are responding to it and thinking about it. And it's really interesting to see, particularly, I will say, in Austin, there's been a ton of new South Asian faces. And with Apple and Google and Samsung and all of these places expanding. And so it's an exciting time for sure.
It sure is. And listeners, if you're listening, I know the YouTube viewers can tell already, but we have a special guest here. It is not Vice President Kamala Harris, but we have the next best thing. We have Neha Dewan, who is the National Co-Chair for South Asians for Harris. Neha, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. And Dinesh, really good to see you after almost 20 years.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, Neha and I went to law school in full transparency in 2024, 2025. And, we've stayed in touch over...
2005.
What? Yeah.
It's been that long.
I want to be younger.
2005.
Yeah, I want to be younger. 2004, 2005 time frame. And, I've just watched Neha go from being an attorney, a law student, to an attorney, to really reaching prominence on the national stage. I think you were at the DNC recently, right?
I was, yeah. It was amazing. Yeah.
Amazing. So we're so glad to have you here. We want to talk about elections and politics and how you got into it, what drives you. But before we do that, why don't you give us an introduction? Because there's no collection of words that I can put together to do justice to properly introduce you. So I'll leave all the titles to you.
Yeah, it's so hard to when somebody asks you to introduce yourself. It's just I don't know. So I graduated law school, worked a clerk, worked for big firms, and then kind of when I came to New York, of course, 2008, the Obama election, I said, wait a second, like where are we? Where is everybody in our community? We're doing great things, but we're not necessarily civically engaged, politically engaged. So I got very involved with Reshma Sajani's congressional campaign. She was the first South Asian woman to ever run for Congress. And I thought that was a huge splash. It was not about sort of waiting your turn or any of those things. So I sort of helped out with our campaign, got very interested in politics at that point and supporting South Asian candidates. From there, went on to South Asians for Obama, where I was the state director for New York. And again, these are grassroots organizations. Which then pivoted to South Asians for Opportunity, an advocacy organization. In 2016, I co-founded South Asians for Hillary. 2019, before the primaries, I started South Asians for Biden, which then pivoted to South Asians for Harris, where I'm the co-national director. So that's kind of been my journey in the political space.
Talk to us a little bit about that perspective of that South Asian female lawyer who's working in law firms. I think it was for Obama. You said it was the Obama campaign where you were looking around and saying, where's the Indian representation?
Yeah,
Talk to us about that perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's just, where are we? I think our community is very quick to write checks and take pictures, but what are we actually doing? Where are we talking about the issues that concern our community? And the other thing I also noticed was that, we have a very small but mighty community. Why is it that we don't know who each other are? across the country. If you have other minority communities, things are happening, you're promoting candidates or issues, where are we? So
Mhm.
that kind of made me think 2008 about that. And then when Reshma kind of came on board, I was just like, this is amazing. This is exactly what I want to do. But then again, why is it somebody in California who doesn't know who Reshma is and is unable to support her? Or when Keisha Ram is running for state Senate in Vermont and comes down for a fundraiser, where's our community? So I think that
Mhm.
was the genesis for me, at least. And what's been really heartening since then is just to see this world open up to
Mhm.
the South Asian community in the political and civic engagement space, political advocacy. It was a big hole that I feel like is sort of being filled. We still have ways to go, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like for me growing up anyway, politics was not something that we talked about. It wasn't something that was mentioned. I remember my dad would go and he would vote, but that was really the extent of it. And we would never talk about it, right? And it never seemed relevant, actually. And so it's so interesting now to almost come full circle. And for me, it feels like there is actually so much relevance in everyday life as far as how we're living it. And so to feel like there's more community engagement and that there's some representation there has actually been really empowering.
I mean, especially for the younger generation. I mean, what
Mhm.
great role models that our generation have to serve for them. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
totally on point there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I have a theory that for you to have that perspective of where you're looking around and saying, where are we as a community? That almost to me has to come from a perspective of a person who sees themselves as an American and who belongs in America and who's taking ownership for the country they're in and the community they're in and what part are they co-creating. And I wonder if that perspective is one that is relatively recent because our parents and grandparents did they see themselves as Americans or more as Indians living in America? Do you see the nuance I'm trying to draw out
Yeah,
here?
yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that's a really good question. I think you continue to sort of see that in this generation. So a lot of the first generation South Asians don't necessarily identify with the word South Asian, right? So it's
Mhm.
more
Mm.
identity based, and I'm Indian American or I'm Pakistani American. And I think perhaps when they first came here, that sense of Americanness wasn't necessarily there until they established themselves, got jobs, had those communities, neighbors, and then sort of had this sense of feeling. And then when they had children, going to schools and meeting up, with other parents in soccer fields, that sense of belonging really came along. So yeah, I mean, I
Mhm.
definitely think that the first generation, they're very proud.
Yeah.
But I think there's some nuances in terms of identity, politics that kind of the first generation, the second generation.
Absolutely. I know my parents would often say things like, "We didn't go to school here. This isn't our school system. These
Mhm.
aren't our universities." And they wouldn't say that because they didn't feel like they belonged to America in that way. But just because it was so unfamiliar. Versus now,
Exactly.
many of us we were born here, we were brought up in the States, and um, the schooling system is familiar. The way we get admitted to university is familiar.
Yeah.
Um, and so we identify more with these everyday pieces of life that just seem so foreign to our parents.
I remember stories of, moving to a new town or city and getting the phone book and going down and
Yeah.
finding like Patels or any Sindhis or anybody else and then calling them up and saying, "Hey, I'm new in town here. Do you want to meet?" Right? Like you're almost looking
Mhm.
for that connection. So yeah, and I think it's a good thing that all of that is changing and it continues to change with every election cycle and every opportunity to get involved. What are the issues of interest that you see South Asians are paying attention to?
Yeah, definitely. So I think immigration is a big issue, whether it's family reunification or employment based immigration. And what's really interesting is that you tend to see women more appreciate the family reunification part because they tend to be sort of
Hmm.
the caregivers, whereas the men are looking more for H-1B or L-1, different categories. But that is a big issue, and I would say that's pretty global across different minority communities as well. That's
Hmm.
one. Another issue that we come across is healthcare. Whether it's access to healthcare, Medicare, Medicaid, cost of prescription drugs, so on and so forth for our community, especially with South Asians that tend to have a very high rate of diabetes. So, things, cost of medication is a big issue. And
Sure.
then you'll see a lot of, gender gap, pay equality in the workspace. Education is very important, access to higher education, STEM jobs, um, admissions to colleges. What does that look like for the South Asian community? So, and of course, economics, right? It's job creation. What is it? Small business owners. What do those applications look like? How easy is access to funds? So, a variety of those issues that we're hearing about, notwithstanding, of course, the racial justice aspect that also affects our community.
Yeah, I'm curious what your perspective is on how the disparity between races and genders is showing up, and how South Asians in general are responding to these issues. Are we finding them to be ones that we're stopping and taking a look at, or are we tending to sweep them under the rug?
No, I mean, I think absolutely we're starting to take, and I think that as we go along over time, we start to examine these issues, right? From when our parents came in, it was almost like, let's just put your head down and do what it is. And as the time went on, it's like, no, wait a second, what's going on in the schools? I want to have a say at the school board. And the next generation is, no, this is very much my country, and these issues affect me. So it's not necessarily being swept under the rug. I also think that there's open discussions that are happening within families that probably didn't happen in the past about issues that may be taboo, or just issues that were never discussed. So I think we as in a community are definitely examining these issues in ways that we probably haven't even in the past. Because now it's become very personal. It's a lot more personal.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by personal?
Yeah, so I think that's what I'm saying. Like, the first generation, it was more about putting your head down and kind of moving along. The second generation is, we're seeing Patels in schools, we're seeing Shaws in school, and having that camaraderie. So we have a sense of understanding that we are here. These issues are our issues, and we have a say about what these issues are, rather than just, these are for, white Americans, and we're just a snippet of it, and this is what we're doing with our space. So yeah, these are our issues, just as much as they are for other communities.
Almost more empowering in the sense of that sense of belonging, that sense of
Absolutely.
you make an excellent point. I don't remember a lot of Indian kids growing up in the schools that I went to, but here it's very typical to see a variety of different cultures come together, even in a state like Texas, where there's a lot of leaning one way or another, if you will. There's a lot of diversity that's also here, and it comes through absolutely in terms of even locally, the school boards. How are they voting? What posters are allowed in schools? What books are allowed in schools? How are teachers allowed to keep their students safe, and how are they not allowed to keep their students safe? Those are all coming to the surface, whereas I don't think that they did before in the way that they are now.
Or even holidays, right? Like New York State has an official holiday for Diwali. Like that's a school holiday. I mean, who would have thought this even a decade ago that something like this would have happened, right? But there's been advocacy around that. There's the Diwali stamp. There's been advocacy about that, and that was there in 2016. So, to your point, Seema, I think you're bang on. That I mean, this is us. These are issues, and this is our community, and we're going to do it just like every other community, because we have the same say.
I was floored. Our school district too adopted it's a student holiday, but teachers are working and students are off, which is still incredible to see Eid honored, to see Diwali honored. In Texas and in our school district, but it's really, really cool to see. But that doesn't happen without, like what you're saying, the advocacy has to be there. The awareness has to be there. Otherwise it just gets lost.
Wait, and to your point about this is more personal. I mean, think about it. If you don't go to your school board meeting and talk about, the holidays or food or whatever it is in the cafeteria, I mean, who's going to talk about it? That's on us. And I think more and more people are doing that now, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Do you see a disparity between maybe our generation, like, I'm in my mid 40s, the younger generation and or the older generation, our parents' age, and I'll just say 50 or above, 60 or above. Or are you seeing that not only is the number or the, the level of engagement in these types of social justice issues and uh, social issues, I should say, is growing, not just because of a function of there's more of us and we're understanding these things, but larger percentages of people who in the past did not care or weren't engaged are also becoming engaged.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely. I mean, I feel like with every election, right? Every cycle, every year, there's a level of engagement. I will share that. I as part of South Asians for Harris, we have a lot of state directors, and we had a call once with a few folks in the Northeast and Virginia as well, because we're going to Pennsylvania to canvass. And everybody on that call was a woman from different states who had run for office. This is first generation women, local, state, congressional races. And I just thought that that was absolutely incredible because I'm just thinking to myself, wow, you were a first generation immigrant, you're a woman, and you put yourself out there in the political space. But now when you look at our generation, that's opened up. And now that I'm looking at the younger generation, I mean, that's like, you're talking about the pyramid, that's even expanding there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. And you mentioned sort of the strategies for South Asians for Harris and these calls with the state directors. Now, I know that you've been running South Asian men for Harris and South Asian women for Harris Zoom calls, and the numbers are staggering. So I don't want to reveal what the numbers are or what you've been able to raise or the engagement. Tell us about those, and along, go into some of the strategies you're using in this election cycle to mobilize the South Asian community, and how folks can ensure that their voices are being heard. Because I think, this is an anecdote, but I think the generalization is that across all communities, it's like, well, what am I going to do? Especially if you're like in a predominantly blue state or a decidedly red state. Do I really need to go out on a cold November night, stand in line and vote or take time away from my kids? It's going to go anyways the way it's going to go. So talk
Mm.
about some of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So, with your second point first, in terms of the blue states, what can you do? Do I matter? I mean, absolutely. If you're looking at some of these margins, and even the purple states, Biden won by 11,000, Bush won something by 6,000. If we all just become very complacent and say, "I'm in New York State, and why does my vote matter?" Imagine if you actually didn't go. And that's
Mhm.
not just for the presidential election. When you're voting for down ballot races, which are very, very personal. Congressional races, and then you're talking about state issues. So in other communities, which may be red states, I mean, you have referendums on reproductive rights. So
Mhm.
it's not just like, does my vote count? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a few states that are blue states that are considered battleground for state races, for congressional races. Your vote absolutely matters. And then the other thing is, for me, I've always said, you are in a blue state or a red state, you can make a difference. But guess what? You may have that auntie in Pennsylvania, and you are then talking to that auntie about different issues. That auntie has a bunch of other aunties who are now going to go out and register voters that probably wouldn't have unless you spoke to them. You're in a blue state, red state. You can phone bank, you can write postcards, you can canvass into other states. In fact, I'm going into Pennsylvania with my 5-year-old this weekend, who coincidentally thinks it's Transylvania because she's been watching all of these
That's
movies.
Oh.
cool.
So I think she's going to be in for a very rude awakening. But
Yeah.
I'm New York. This is, I can go, I can do this. I've canvassed in Pennsylvania, I've canvassed in Virginia, I've canvassed in New Hampshire, but I'm a New Yorker. So there, you can make a difference. And if you do nothing, you don't want to canvass, you don't want to phone bank, you don't want a postcard write, you don't want a text bank, nothing. All you can do is make sure you're registered, you show up, go to 5 people, make sure they're registered in whatever states they are, whoever you're close to. They go to the polls and have them contact 5 people wherever they are.
Mm.
So yeah, you can absolutely make a difference in blue state or red state. There's a lot of things you can do. South Asians for Harris pivoted from South Asians for Biden. Since then, there have been other grassroots that have come up. So South Asian women for Harris, South Asian men for Harris. And they've had us as South Asians for Harris on these calls because we've done all this work from 2020, and we had launched in April and so on and so forth. And it was a big call for organizing, right? What is it that you can do? And I think our presence on those calls were, we already have this set up. Like, come join us. We have you motivated. The South Asian for Women Harris call had 10,000 registrants. There were 5,000 people on that call.
Wow.
Raised close to $300,000. And this happened within 72 hours of the announcement, right?
Mhm.
Again, talk about the power of our community, reaching out, social media, galvanizing all these people. 72 hours from that, the South Asian Men for Harris launched. And they had reached out to us again because of the apparatus that we had. And and these are folks who've never been political, and said, okay, how do we set this up? How do we get a razor link on what we do? And then we were in that space. And I think the great thing about some of these groups are, especially for instance, the South Asian Men, they're uplifting organizations that have women leaders. They didn't have to have us on the call. It could have strictly have just been a South Asian Men thing, but they had a variety of different women talking about a variety of different issues. And the great thing, even though about splinter groups, are they're reaching people that maybe we wouldn't have been able to reach. But here we are kind of providing access to opportunities on a platter. I was just on a call 2 nights ago for South Asian Women for Harris, again, talking about what is it that we can do. And I just went and said, hey, these are all the opportunities. Up to you, what it is that you want to do.
That's incredible. Can you speak a little bit more to, before we hit record, we were just sort of commenting about how there's a lot out there, right? Especially with AI. It's hard to know what's actually happening. Or is that just someone who has a skewed perspective on what's happening and they happen to be on a larger platform that's disseminating this information, right? How can we, as South Asian Americans, make educated decisions about what to do and how we actually, how can we gather that information and vote in a way that's aligned with us? And importantly, if you can speak to people who live in deeply red states, because typically some of these states are, it's like you said, where it feels like it doesn't matter how you vote, the outcome's going to just be this one way, all the way down, whether it's at a state level or a local level. You might start to see a little bit of a shift. But what can we do to empower ourselves to make better educated decisions, especially in a climate where we feel like die is already cast?
I think the biggest thing is, and we talked about this too, is sort of to drown out the noise, because there's a lot that's kind of coming at you, right, from different directions. And even the media that might be, like you said, skewed in a particular direction. So it just not just with elections, with anything, I think we would encourage people to do their own research. So not just talk to somebody who says, oh, well, actually, I saw a snippet about how Kamala Harris is going to increase unrealized capital gains tax at 45%. And that was just a snippet that was taken. And I actually said, this does not sound right. Let me just go and dig a little bit deeper. I'm not going to just see this on the social media because it's a large network. And I was just like, wait a second. This is not what it is. This is not affecting me. This is not even affecting people who make less than $5 million. And the unrealized capital gains tax is in a completely different space than what was just pulled out of it. But here, this was showed on this network, and now people are freaking out. And I mean, educated people are freaking out that, hey, I don't make that much, but now you're taking 45% on unrealized gains, right? So part of it is you just have to do your research. Go to these websites of the campaign. They cannot put out stuff that they're just pushing out, lies in that sense. Go to experts. And I think I just mentioned this too. We're talking about a medical issue. Are you going to trust a troll on Twitter, or are you going to go to Vivek Murthy, who's a surgeon general, right? Those kinds of issues that you need to, the decisions that you need to make. And I recognize that that's not very easy for the vast majority of Americans who may just not be in that, educated space or the desire, or they're just, saddled down with childcare responsibilities and just are not able to get on the internet and so those and what they see is these snippets. And I think that's very challenging. But I would just encourage those of us who do have access to go out there and research and do your research yourself. You just cannot believe everything that comes out there. Especially now with AI, right? You have pictures and you're just like, Jesus, is this actually the case? There could be 5 versions of my pictures. Hopefully great looking ones, but it's not reality anymore. So you have to be very careful.
Yeah. So don't get and I say this in jest, but also in seriousness, Facebook, WhatsApp, they're great for checking in on Dadi who lives in India and, you want to FaceTime her or whatever else, but maybe not get your political news from there. It sounds ridiculous, but really, truly, people do it, right? And they fully believe that it's a credible source.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things that we're doing with South Asians for Harris is we have a rapid response team, and this is exactly what we did in 2020 as well. That is automatically, as things come out with the campaign, putting out graphics that give the correct information and dropping it in all of these WhatsApp groups that we'd already been a part of in the 2020 election. So there's a way to disseminate this in Facebook groups that we were already part of. So now you have this information that's also being disseminated. There's a lot out there that has to be combated, and all we can do from our end is put information that clear up that misinformation, and try to disseminate that as far and wide as we can.
And then what would you, kind of just circling back, because I live in a red state, right? Or even if I lived in a heavily blue state, and what would you say to the voter who's just like, this is just not going to matter?
No, but that's what I'm saying. Like, it's every vote counts. I mean, you're talking about some races that go down to the school board. I mean, imagine if somebody over there wins by 2 votes and it's on an issue that you cared about, but you just never showed up at the polls. It's not, when you look at red states, people just automatically think presidential election, but this is beyond just presidential election. I mean, you have 468 seats in the U.S. Congress that's on the line at this point, 33 Senate seats that can change the dynamics of the Senate, 435 the House of Representatives. I mean, can you imagine if people just said, it doesn't matter, I'm in a red state? And going right down to your school board, and all of a sudden now they're saying, these are different kinds of books that we're going to read. We're not going to teach about, what history would look like. And you just didn't show up. And then the other opponent just won by 1 vote. And guess what? Your kids are now reading books that you don't think that they should, because it's not representing history. So you matter. I mean, no matter where you are, you absolutely matter. And I think that's the message that people should take away, that you can't just sit at home and be complacent. You also are making decisions for the rest of the world. The U.S. is the greatest country. People across the world are looking at us. Some people wish that they could have that choice to make those choices, and that's in your hands, and you can't just give that up.
I love that you said that. I love that you mentioned that this is not a responsibility just for you or your children, but one you can take to lead with everyone else to direct how the world sees things.
Yeah, I'm not sure a lot of people drill down to the issues at the state level or the local level to think about in an election cycle, that looking to see who to vote for Senate or Congress or things like that. And part of it might be just the volume of time or information you have to parse through, right? You look at the ballot, you see the presidential candidates, and then you're just looking down, and most people, I'm guessing, this is just my suspicion, will just vote along party lines, right? So you look at a Democratic senator, you look at a Democratic congressman, you look at a Democratic governor or whatever, right, that you're voting for all the way down. Is there an easy way or a less voluminous way of digesting a lot of information to really figure out what issues are on the table and then make a decision whether we care about them or they impact us?
There are some states that have, websites that kind of compress all of these. Like, for instance, Democratic Party, these are the different races. This is these are the issues. But the vast majority of time, that's not the case. And it's up to the voter to kind of register. And yes, people tend to vote along party lines, battleground states, not so much. But there's always those questions on there too. Like, do you want your taxes to go up so you can fund this capital project, or do any of those different things? So, it's not just along party lines in that sense. Like, those are very personal questions. But yeah, I wish there was a way, like a magic way to say, here's all the comprehensive information. This is where you go. But that tends to happen, on an individual basis. And there are some states that make it a little bit easier, but it's just too much, too many issues, too many. Think about it. There's 468 just congressional races. So now you trickle that down, like how much people are working, they're, have kids. How much of
Yeah.
that is actually going to be digestible? I think it's incumbent upon us, and I think it's very easy to say that. But really, what is the issue that matters to you at this point?
Yeah.
And then for you to try to figure out, okay, well, who's the candidate that speaks to me? And again, this is the vast majority of people are not going to do that. A lot of times, it's the politicos who, digest this and bring that out. But yeah, I mean, I do think that's something that needs to be more easily, readily available for people.
You know, in India, right, there's so many different types of Indian. They speak different languages, different castes, different foods, and things like that. But I have to think at some level in the US, the issues facing South Asians or Indians or Pakistanis are more similar because we're more alike here than we're different, right? Even though we may speak different languages or things like that. And I know, like, when I go out to an Indian restaurant with my Indian friends, we can't even figure out how to split the bill, right? And sometimes we can't even figure out which restaurant to go to because someone's vegetarian and someone's not. And my friends eat beef, I don't eat beef. There's a lot of diversity, right? And I think that diversity is great. It's something to be celebrated. In the U.S., we're more united than different. And what do you see as the biggest challenges, and how are you approaching that as sort of a way of uniting this really diverse swath of people that come from the South Asian subcontinent?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And what we have seen is that it tends to also depend on generation. So, the first generation, it tends to be, we're not necessarily South Asian, we're Indian, we're Pakistani. And, we're going to we raised our kids speaking Gujarati. And the second generation is like, no, well, I'm South Asian. All of these issues are very collective that impact us. There's only so many of us. Let's just kind of hold hands and do this. And I may or may not speak Gujarati. Right. And then the next generation is even different. One of the things that we did during the 2020 cycle is understanding that there's identity and religious differences. What is it that we can do that we still target the voters and get the message across? Because the first generation is not paying attention necessarily to South Asian. So what I did was I started these councils. Indians for Biden, Afghanis for Biden, Nepali, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. We would be able to, the messages that we were creating, what were the graphics and WhatsApp would then be disseminated into these groups that they were more likely to be able to accept or digest because it's coming from what they identify with. We had Hindus for Biden, Sikhs for Biden, same thing. We were able to disseminate that information. So yes, it's a very large subcontinent. I mean, you're looking at 8 or 9 different countries, God knows how many different languages. So that tends to be a challenge sometimes. But what we're also trying to do is have it be something of celebration. We want to make sure that, our voter guides, access to ballot and things like that are translated in different languages. And that's coming right from the community, right? So the person who's Afghani and is doing Pashto is on board with doing something like this as the person who's Bangladeshi, yet there might be a Hindu person who's doing Gujarati or whatever, but they have a common goal. So we have these differences, which I think tend to almost disappear little by little as the generations go on. They see it more as a collective blend than this, gigantic divide. And also the first generation focuses a lot on foreign policy issues. The next generation tends to be a potpourri of domestic issues. And then the next generation, I mean, I can't even tell you. Hopefully we'll talk about the next generation because it's just blowing me out of the water in terms of what these kids are doing. But I think we tend to unite a little bit more. There's not just like, oh, I'm going to marry somebody from the same village or, who only speaks Gujarati. Now it's okay, well, Punjabi and whatever, Pakistani or Bangladeshi, and then outside the community. So, yeah, I think it's a bit of both.
That's so, I think that that's a lot of truth in that for sure that I'm seeing, but you piqued my interest. Tell us about the next generation. You said that they're doing all sorts of out of the box things. What's going on there?
Yeah, these kids, I tell you, I was probably still playing with Barbies at their age. I mean, I just cannot believe the things that they're doing. They're delegates to the convention. Avi Dihani, who's a part of South Asians for Harris, is an 18-year-old. He is the youngest delegate from Georgia. He has cerebral palsy. He was the the chair of the high school Democrats of Georgia. I mean, like, where were we doing any of this? We have a 12-year-old who's on phone banking, who's a rising star. I mean, a 12-year-old. You have the vast majority of folks in South Asian Harris at this time are youth leads. It looked very different in 2020. And they're just younger and younger, and they want to be involved. They're out there on campuses doing voter registration, listening to what the youth, the issues that matter to the youth, and they're just coming out of the woodworks. And it's amazing. And I think part of it is also this acceptance of that the South Asian community is going to move beyond these STEM job choices, and we are more civically engaged as we're going on, and there is appetite to be in the political space, and it kind of trickles down. But how young that they're getting involved in the issues that they care about. I mean, so Avi is from Georgia, where the unfortunate shooting happened yesterday, and he just wrote an op-ed about this. What was I doing when I was 18 years old, please? So it's very heartening to see this. And I mean, this is not just in blue states. I mean, this is everywhere. You have the Republican Party, Democratic Party kids that are coming up. And I imagine their kids, my kids, I can imagine their kids are probably going to be much more engaged than I was at 18.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? First of all, that's incredible. And I agree. So heartening to hear that these kids are taking an active role in shaping the future. I think worried about my SAT scores at that point. And me, myself, and I. What about them is the impetus for doing this? Because this is just unheard of.
No, it absolutely is. And I think they're also seeing those role models that are out there, right? So if you're 18 years old and you're just like, oh my goodness, you're hearing about things more, there's social media as opposed to just that one platform when it used to be newspaper, and maybe CNN or Fox News or whatever. Now there's ways of accessing. And then other people around you are becoming even more involved. You're then looking at, okay, well, Pramila Jayapal is now the first South Asian woman in Congress, and you have 5 instead of 2. And you have that runway, that pipeline, and you see other people in the space. And again, the same thing in terms of appetite for the government to be in a different space than the first generation that imposed that on our generation, and our generation that's not necessarily doing that to the next generation. And they care about these issues. I mean, they're getting younger and younger, but they care about the issues that they care about. And for them, it's not about putting their head down. They are Americans, and it is personal to them. And so they're just putting it out there to say, all right, what is it that I can do? Because I can make a difference.
Yeah. So what would you say, because my kids are kind of in this middle, they're not really that young, but they're not in high school yet. What would you say to parents who have children in they're coming up, right? To help them just create awareness for their kids, and whether or not they take it forward and do something with it or not, right? They don't have to be phone banking. They don't have to do anything. But these kids that you're talking about clearly were exposed to these issues and deeply empathize with the human condition within them that then is saying, like, let's go do something about this. So what are things that you might say to parents like me who also want to instill a sense of global citizenship and leadership within their children?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to have those conversations, right? Like, unfortunately, now we're dealing with my daughter started kindergarten, and there was a sign. This is New York. Said no rifles, shotguns, or handguns. And I'm like, Jesus, isn't that just a no-brainer, right? So that issue is very near and dear to my heart. I'm going to have that conversation with my child about these are not just emergency drills. Like, this is what this looks like, and this is what's happening in America right now. Or there's different issues about maybe healthcare, access to that, or the cost of certain things affecting my child. So it's about having those. You don't have to be political. It's just, what are those conversations, and conversations that we didn't have with our parents because they were either uncomfortable, they weren't necessarily political, they were just focused on building a life. Yeah, I mean, I think you have to talk about what matters to you and your family. One of the things that we did in 2020 that was really great was we had like grandmothers writing postcards with like 10-year-olds, and it became a family activity. So the grandmother who never did anything, and the kid who was just coming up, and now in COVID, you don't have much to do. But now all of a sudden you're thinking, oh my God, I wrote a postcard and it went X and I made a difference. So you don't have to do all of these things, Canvas, phone bank, whatever, but there's a different part that you can play. But I think that starts with a conversation at home in terms of what matters to you and your family.
You know, one of the things that's been a recurring theme on this podcast, because we have a lot of South Asian guest is whether we have like an American name or an Indian name, right? And sometimes we shorten it to make it easier, things like that. So I wanted to ask a question based on a couple articles that I saw and maybe a trend that I was picking up. You know, if you go back to a couple of elections, like it was Hillary versus whoever, right? Or we talk about Obama and then Michelle. Or now we're talking about Kamala versus Biden or Kamala versus Trump. And, you know, I wonder if you're also noticing, or maybe it's just I'm hypersensitive to this tendency to refer to women in power or women in leadership position by their first name, but refer to their male counterparts by their last name, right? And I did a little bit of Googling before today, and I saw that someone had written an op-ed on it and sort of also picked up on this. And I was like, hey, this I've never thought about it, but now the more I think about it, like, oh my God, like is this what we're doing subconsciously?
Mhm.
And what is the impact of that? And is there something deeper there that we can tease out? And I thought, you know, knowing everything I know about you, Neha, and I've known you for 20 years, I thought that you would be the perfect person to shed some at least some light on the nuances, and even if it's just opinion, like we want to know what your thoughts are because I'm sure they're more mature than the thoughts I have.
I mean, that's a lot of pressure, Dinesh. But
Well, I
I
don't mean
think
mature. I mean like
Mature.
developed.
yeah,
Like
yeah, no,
yeah,
no, no.
Yeah.
yeah,
No, I think honestly, I think that's a brilliant question. And wherever you saw that and whatever the genesis of that idea was, it's amazing because I don't think I've ever one thought about it. I don't think I've ever been asked. I don't think that's ever been discussed or that I've read.
mm,
But when you think about it, yeah, I mean, you're talking about Trump, Biden, Obama, Hillary, Kamala. There seems to be that perception, but then if you also look at other women, you have Condoleezza Rice, and you say Michelle Obama,
mhm,
not just only Michelle. You have Madeleine Albright, Nancy Pelosi, who also is called Pelosi,
yeah,
at times. So you have a hodgepodge of different ways in which you've addressed women. But I do see where you're coming from, and men tend to go with the last name. I personally think the first name is amazing. It's as if
mhm,
you've established yourself in the
Mhm.
community and in the world. So if somebody's saying Neha, they're referring to you, that's incredible. But if somebody's saying, oh, Neha Dewan, it's almost like you have to identify with that it's another, you know what I mean? You're
yeah,
identifying that person with their last name. I almost think that gives more prominence. So
Mhm.
it's not, to me, it's not a dig at calling somebody with their first name. I almost think that's giving them more prominence. But it is a
mm,
very interesting observation, if you do actually think about
Mhm.
yeah, and not just prominence. I feel like there's a connection, right? I think you know when Vice President Harris was running or was chosen as Joe Biden's running mate. Colloquially, a lot of South Asians were like, you know, it's Kamala auntie, right? Like she's someone like we can relate to, and you felt this instant connection. So I never thought of it as sort of a dig or diminishing a woman's role or presence.
have a
But
sweatshirt that says Auntie Kamala with her
oh, they
picture
do,
on it that somebody
Yeah.
gave me in 2020. And
yeah.
it's so funny because if she actually becomes president, that would even be funnier because it's like, Auntie Kamala is now president.
I love
So
And then I have
funny.
another shirt that says I'm still speaking because of what happened with
Oh,
Mike Pence during the debate. Another one
yeah.
that says I'm speaking. Another one that says the first but not the last. And this is all from 2020. And it's
So
incredible
great.
because I can wear all of that today. In fact, I
Yeah.
probably will
Mhm.
when I go canvassing to Transylvania. But it's so still so relevant. It's just so cool.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
moment was really empowering. I remember thinking, and I use that even in daily conversation. My family is pretty boisterous, and if I learned very quickly, if I don't speak up, I don't get heard.
Yeah.
And that was I just such an empowering,
No, absolutely.
way
I
for
tell
me
my
to cut
husband,
through. So speaking of Kamala Harris, you mentioned that there was a photo in particular that you wanted to talk about. So I wanted to give you the space to do that.
yes. So I will show it to you, and hopefully for the folks who are not able to see it, they can. So this is a picture that was given to me at the DNC by a colleague of mine, Sanjay Kumar, who is a very prominent lawyer, voter protection space, and she just gave it to me. She's like, "Oh, I bought this for you." So I brought it home. I was just so curious. I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I went to the 2-year-old and I said, "Who does she look like?" And she said, "Mommy." And then I showed her a random picture of a white American, and I said, "Who does she look like?" And she was just silent, right? So I was like, oh, this is a 2-year-old that can now make a difference between somebody who is not white and somebody who's white. And she identifies the person who's not white as mommy. So then I
Mm.
said, okay, well, this is a 2-year-old. What does she know? Let me go to my 5-year-old. And the same thing. I showed her the picture and she said mommy. And it was just amazing. I'm like, I have 2 years old, 5-year-old who, regardless of the outlet, the outcome of the election, they see somebody and it's them. I went to high school in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where there were 2,000 people and the only South Asians were me and my sister. And now you're looking at somebody on the main stage and my kids are identifying with her. I mean, that's amazing. And my 5-year-old, with Transylvania, I mean, that's the first foray for her into seeing, here's Kamala Harris. Like, you were part of history, regardless of what happened. And this is our community as well. Now on the international stage, not just running for school board or what it was.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very powerful. And I think that is something I will keep with me and definitely share with other people because I'm sure I'm not the only one.
It's interesting that you said that, because not only is it that she is identifying as mommy, but it's also opening possibilities for what that picture, being in that picture, represents for someone that looks like you. So I have no doubt that one day, hopefully, we can say that Madame Dewan was on the Happy Human podcast, and
I don't know about
be
that, but hopefully my daughter,
maybe
I've
your
been trying
daughter.
to teach her, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'm trying to teach her to say president, but she just said unicorn the other day. So I feel like
You
we
know
have some
what?
work to do on her.
Oh, good.
But,
Yeah.
Unicorn can mean anything, right? Like a unique sparkle of joy, no matter what field you're in. I
Yeah.
hope she turns out to be a unicorn.
But I hope she does
Absolutely.
say president too at some point and use it and not have me be that, generational parent who's now like, you need to go to engineering school or whatever. You need to be
Yes.
president.
You need to be president.
I love it.
So good.
Neha, I know it's probably the busiest 2 months of the next 4 years for you. So we really appreciate you coming on the show. We can't thank you enough. I frankly want to say thank you for taking my phone call or my email.
Oh, you're so sweet. You're sweet. I mean, this is part of the community, right? Like, this is how we
Yeah.
build community. And this is important. You can't just ignore somebody who's reaching out for something. I mean, this is how we get to know each other.
Yeah.
And maybe tomorrow I'll say, hey, guess what? Maybe you should have X on for X reason. And now we're building a network and growing that network. And that's always been my goal and dream, is to bring the community together.
Yeah.
But we live in an instant gratification world, and folks have just spent about an hour listening to us. We want you to tell us one thing, whether from your work as a lawyer or on the political campaigns, that we can change our lives with right away if we implemented. Advice straight from Neha.
I mean, I think I would be remiss in saying that you should go vote. I mean, that would be the biggest thing, especially in what's going to happen in nine weeks. And not just vote now in 2024. I mean, there's midterm elections. You have elections in your state that are off cycle. I mean, go vote. Go vote. Take your auntie to go vote. Make sure she's registered. Make sure you're complying with all the state deadlines, because it's not all the same. But you vote, because you're literally, I really believe that you're voting for the world, and it does not matter which state you're in.
So powerful. It often can feel like, what's the big deal? Like I'm just getting in my little car and like checking off a box, but it's these little things. I think that's what Dinesh and you were asking earlier about the impetus of the show, and how we even decided to come together to create this platform. And it really is, and was, the recognition of how powerful these simple, small things that we can do every day that actually end up moving mountains, right? So listeners, if this is your first time, Ask It Forward works like this. Neha will be asked a question that somebody else previous left for her, not knowing who she was, what we were going to talk about, when this episode was going to air. And then, so Neha, you get to answer that question as honestly as you can, and then you'll get to leave a question for the next guest. So Neha, this question is from Dr. Akash Bajaj. He is a longevity expert out of California, and he was on the show talking about all the ways we can elevate our lives and be healthier using his background in anesthesiology, pain management, and longevity medicine. So he asks of you, if you could go back to yourself at age 20, what is the one action you would tell yourself not to do that would have changed your life?
I think just being complacent and not being engaged. Honestly, I really wish I could. I mean, take so much inspiration from the next generation and saying, geez, I could have been doing this at 12, 14, 16, been a delegate to these conventions, talking to different people, but I was just in my own bubble and, doing my own thing, which I'm sure a lot of other people, my generation were also. So I just wish I was engaged in a much younger age where I could have made even more of a difference had I started earlier.
All right. What's your question, Neha, for the next guest?
Yeah, so, in keeping with this theme of the next generation, I mean, I think it would be really curious to know what the next person feels about the work that they're doing, what the impact will be on the next generation.
That's a good one. That's a
That
good
is a
one.
really good question.
Listeners, we always encourage you to reflect on these questions yourself. I know Dinesh and I do, because they're really great questions to ask.
We can't thank you enough for coming on here. And at the Happy and Human podcast, we have a little tradition of asking our guests to highlight an organization that matters to them, that's near and dear to their heart. And on behalf of you, Seema and I will make a contribution to that organization to hopefully raise some awareness amongst our listeners, and as a small token of our appreciation for you spending some time with us and sharing so many important nuggets and your experiences. So with that, is there an organization that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, no, first of all, I just want to say this is just such a kind thing to do. This is not something that is typically done. It's a very, it's just such a lovely idea, and I wish other people would consider that as well. So thank you for giving this platform. I actually have two organizations. So I would say that if there was a certain budget that you wanted to, allocate for this, I would split it between two organizations. And one is Save the Children. It's an organization that I also donate to on a regular basis. I It's even more near and more, near and dear to my heart more after having had two children, to see the fact that they can sit out there and play and go to the park and swim or whatever, and then you have kids in Sudan without food, or they're maimed and they're playing with stones or whatever it is. And so whatever you can do to change the lives of these children in every corner of the world is very meaningful to me. And then the second one would be Autism Speaks, because I have family members with autism and there's a lack of awareness, there's a lack of support services. And they're doing a wonderful job of just creating a space and making it safe and destigmatized. So I think that would be very meaningful to me as well.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, and absolutely, we'd be happy to contribute to both of them, but only because we've known each other for 20 years. So we don't want
Yeah.
future guests to get the idea that they can give us a dozen organizations.
No, and I hope to see you at the
Yeah,
reunion next year, Dinesh.
yeah,
So we
I
can.
plan to be there. Yeah,
What, Neha? I know, again, you're clearly juggling a lot right now with where we are at politically in the landscape, but where can our audience connect with you? Just give our listeners where they can find more of this wonderful energy that is Neha.
I mean, I first of all, I really want to pitch South for Harris, because we could use all the help. Get everybody engaged, involved in different ways. So I would encourage people to go to Linktree/SA4Harris, and there's a lot of different ways to get involved. But I'm present on social media, and people have actually reached out to me, which I think is wonderful, in terms of getting plugged. And hopefully, we will be a part of a network where it'll be easier for us to just know who the other person is and be able to access each other. But yeah, I mean, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to talk to people, get people engaged. I really feel like that's my calling. And I love it. Absolutely love it.